Kadishayim, Kadishayim, Bikdish Asar Shabbat Samisachides, Besoiru Seichu. Kadishayim, Kadishayim, Bikdish Asar Shabbat Samisachides, Besoiru Seichu. Pesach, Pesach Lohem, Noyam Berutzoim, Nifto Voyach, Sharei Retzoy Lechu. Pesach, Pesach Lohem, Noyam Berutzoim, Nifto Voyach, Sharei Retzoy Lechu.
Hello everyone, this is the fifth and final segment of Happiness on Shabbos, and today I'd like to give my opinion on this issue. So what's the bottom line? And I think it all comes down to shul and davening, like everything in this podcast. When it comes to shul, the Rambam paskins in Hilchos Tefillah that, and I quote, "B'atei knisiyot u'b'atei midrashot nohagin bahen kavod." You have to have honor to the shul. How does this manifest itself? For example, the Gemara in Brachot says that ki beito, just like at home. Ma beito akapandria kabidinish. You'd be very upset if someone goes through your home in order to get to another home without knocking. But arakika uminal lo kabidinish. But say you walk around with your slippers, you wouldn't actually mind if someone comes into your house with your slippers. So too in shul. In other words, act in shul like you act at home. But not so in the Beis HaMikdash, in Hilchot Beit HaBechira. When the Rambam talks about the Beit HaMikdash, he adds that it's not enough kavod, but rather mitzvat aseh liyira min HaMikdash. You have to have awe from the Beis HaMikdash, and of course awe from God, who commanded on this awe. And how does this manifest itself? Lo yikanes lahar habayit b'maklo, o b'min'al sheberaglav, o b'apuntanto, o be'avak she'al raglav. Amongst many things, you cannot come into the Beis HaMikdash with leather shoes, something you can do in shul. You can't come into the Beis HaMikdash with a stick, something you can do in shul. In other words, a shul should be treated like your home, but a Beis HaMikdash on a much higher level. Explain Rav Soloveitchik. There's a difference in encountering God between Shabbos and Yom Tov and between Beis HaMikdash and shul. Says Rav Soloveitchik, sometimes God invites you to His home, namely the Beis HaMikdash, and you're God's guest. But Lifrakim, sometimes God comes down from His heavenly abode, and He actually puts His holy presence in your home. You are the host, and God is the guest. Goes on Rav Soloveitchik and says, on Yom Tov we go to God's home. We go Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot to the Beis HaMikdash. And therefore we're obligated then in Simcha, because as we said before, according to Rav Soloveitchik, Simcha always means standing before God. But this is not the case on Shabbos. On Shabbos, God comes to our home, and therefore there is no mitzvah of Simcha, but rather God comes to our home, and ha'adam chayav lekaber et panav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu latzet likrat kala, and therefore we go out to greet God and say, please come in. Based on this, we can understand the famous Gemara that everybody knows. That's basically the basis of Lecha Dodi. The Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Kuf Yotet, says the following words: Rav Chanina mitatev v'ka'afnei demali de. He would dress up for Shabbos and say, "Bol v'nitzeh likrat Shabbat hamalka." Let's go out to greet Shabbos coming into our home. Rabbi Yanai lavish mani me'ala Shabbat. He would put on his nice clothing. Va'amar boi kala, boi kala. So indeed, that's exactly what we do in Lecha Dodi. We say boi kala, boi kala. We go out to greet the Shabbos queen. It explains Rav Hershel Shechter in the name of Rav Soloveitchik, his Rebbe. Lifnei knisat Shabbat omrim kabbalat Shabbat, aval lo matzinu shelifnei Yom Tov yamru perkei Tehillim b'shem kabbalat pnei hayom tov. And therefore, explains Rav Shechter in the name of Rav Soloveitchik, exactly what we said, namely that just like there's a difference between going to the Beis HaMikdash and going to shul, so too there's a difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov. On Shabbos, God comes to our home. On Yom Tov, we go to God's home. And therefore, explained Rav Soloveitchik, Simcha means standing before God. Every time you see the word Simcha in Sefer Devarim, it's you're before God in the Beis HaMikdash or within the walls of Yerushalayim, and that is the ultimate Simcha. But since on Shabbos we don't go to God's home, but God comes to our home, there is no mitzvah of Simcha. And this will explain why there's a Kabbalat Shabbat, going out to greet God, to welcome Him into our home, but not a Kabbalat Yom Tov, because on Yom Tov we go to God's home, we go to the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore it would be obviously very silly to go ahead and say, let's go greet God, if indeed you're going to His home. If anything, God's greeting you. Based on this, I believe that at the end of the day, the Jewish people indeed paskined that there's no mitzvah of simcha on Shabbos. There's only a mitzvah of simcha on Yom Tov. Indeed, the Shibbolei Haleket said in the name of the Sifri that we quoted so many times, Ubeyom Simchatchem Elu Shabbatot, it is a Sifri, and therefore he said you should end the bracha, the fourth bracha of the Amida, with the words V'yismechu b'chakol Ohavei Shemecha. But that's not how we paskin. Rather, in every siddur you will see that the end of the bracha is V'yanuchuvo Yisrael Mekadshei Shemecha, the other opinion in the Shibbolei Haleket, which means that at the end of the day there is no mitzvah simcha on Shabbos. From this perspective, you can understand why the Torah says in the name of the Ritzkei that on a regular Shabbos you say Tzidkat Tzedek, which is Tziduk Hadin, namely saying, God, we don't know why people die, but we accept your judgment. And indeed, Moshe Rabbeinu, David HaMelech were taken from us on Shabbos, and therefore we'd say Tzidkat Tzedek. But says the Torah, you don't say it on Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah, Purim that come out on Shabbos, or Yom Tov that comes out on Shabbos, because, and I quote, the halalu yemei simcha ninu. These and only these are days of happiness. B'kol echad mehem omrim Hallel, because on these days you say Hallel. Not so on a regular Shabbos. Namely, according to the Torah, regular Shabbos is not a day of Simcha, and you can say Tzidkat Tzedek. Indeed, the Shulchan Aruch paskins very clearly that even though you're supposed to have nice clothing for Shabbos, Bigdei Yom Tov yoter tovim mishel Shabbat. Yom Tov clothing should be nicer than Shabbos clothing, and explains the Magen Avraham mishum dechayev besimcha, because only on Yom Tov are you obligated in Simcha. From this perspective, you can understand the famous Ramah that dictates why there's no duchening in Chutz La'aretz all year long. He says in order to duchen, you have to be besimcha, and the Jewish people are only besimcha at Musaf of Yom Tov. Not getting into that, he has to explain why not on Shabbos, and he explains, Afilu b'Shabbatot hashana. So obviously the Ramah says that on Shabbos we're still fatumult with the week, and therefore it's hard to be besimcha. But more importantly, the Ramah does not assume that there's simcha on Shabbos. So I believe both the Shulchan Aruch, who says you should have nice clothing for Shabbos, but at the end of the day, Yom Tov clothing should be better, because, says the Magen Avraham, there's a mitzvah of simcha only on Yom Tov, and the Ramah, who says that you don't duchen on Shabbos, a regular Shabbos, simply because there isn't enough simcha on Shabbos. I believe that they both paskin that there's no mitzvah of simcha on Shabbos. And in order to conclude, let's just take one misnomer out there and ruin it. In most siddurs, for some reason, there's a big mistake. At the end of Lecha Dodi, it says that you're supposed to say Gam Beri'na ובצהלה on Yom Tov, but on Shabbos gam besimcha ובצהלה. It's actually the opposite, obviously. A regular Shabbos has Rina, there's song, but there's no simcha. Only on a Yom Tov that fell out on a Shabbos, if your custom is to say Lecha Dodi, then indeed you should say Gam besimcha ובצהלה. This is exactly what the Mata Ephraim says in endless places. He says that Mevuar mimash katav Harizal lomar b'Yom Tov besimcha uvetzahla. And indeed, he talks about the first day of Sukkot coming out on Shabbos, and he says, and I quote, "V'av shebechol Shabbatot hashana hem omrim b'Rina uvetzahla, hayom shehu Yom Tov omrim besimcha uvetzahla." In other words, at the end of Lecha Dodi, when it's a Yom Tov, you say besimcha uvetzahla, because it's a day of simcha as well. But if it's a regular Shabbos, it's not a day of simcha, and therefore you say only berina. From this perspective, I believe that even though there are many proofs that say there's a mitzvah of simcha on Shabbos, at the end of the day, Shulchan Aruch, Ramah, and those that we paskin like, and our minhag is indeed to say there isn't a mitzvah of simcha on Shabbos. Simcha means going before God to the Beis HaMikdash, which happens on Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot. It does not happen every Shabbos, and therefore Shabbos is a wonderful day. It's a day of kavod ve'oneg, but a day not of simcha.
Shabbat